Hi. Because in some ways this sermon is about gratitude, I want to acknowledge with gratitude the main sources of this sermon. Robin Wall Kimmerer, through her book Braiding Sweetgrass, Dr. Michael Paul Nelson, he wrote an article that I read, Evan Eisenberg, who wrote Ecology of Eden, and Aldo Leopold, who wrote the Sand County Almanac. Okay. Does sustainability and spirituality sound like two unrelated and somewhat vague topics? I have long thought that the only way to achieve a culture that can live sustainably is to underpin it with a religion that calls people into right relationship with the environments we are part of. We need a religion that reminds us to be humble in the face of the awesome creation that we depend on for our breath, our water, and our food. A religion that reminds us to be grateful to the ground we walk on. A religion that asks us to treat all beings, human and otherwise, with respect. My son said to me last weekend that the way we treat natural ecosystems is a reflection of the way we treat each other. Think about that for a minute. The way we treat natural ecosystems is a reflection of the way we treat each other. A 1987 report sponsored by the UN defined sustainability as meeting human needs in a socially just manner without depriving ecosystems of their health. This definition is not as helpful as it sounds. What do humans need? What does ecosystem health look like? What is a socially just manner? Maybe more important, who gets to decide the answers to those questions? Which I think is where common ground comes in. In an article in American Scientist, Dr. Michael Paul Nelson, an environmental ethicist, says, when we talk about sustainability, we rarely clarify what assumptions we are bringing to the table. Failure to have direct conversations about what we value and why has contributed to inaction and political paralysis in confronting enormous ecological challenges such as climate change. If we want to try to live more sustainably, we need scientific information, yes, but we also need to decide what we value and what we consider ethically acceptable, and then to enact policies that encompass both scientific and ethical realities, end quote. He goes on to say, our current intertwined environmental crises, not just climate change, but also pandemics, pollution, food insecurity, and biodiversity loss, are scientific problems, but they are also economic and technological problems. Most notably, they are ethical problems that demand an ethical response. These environmental crises have grown out of ethical assumptions that Western nations have made over centuries about our proper role in the natural world. After some technical stuff, he said, too many of us who are concerned about climate change have been committing the is-ought fallacy, attempting to motivate actions in response to climate change from scientific descriptions alone, without articulating what we value, what is worth saving, and what we hold dear. These are, he says, quote, perhaps the greatest set of challenges that we humans have ever faced. Philosophy and ethics will be a crucial part of the unbridled imagination needed to solve them. End quote. Dr. Nelson makes several very important points. First, to move towards sustainability, we need to have conversations about what we value and why. These are difficult conversations, and our society doesn't really have a mechanism for having them. Years ago, I had a conversation with a more conservative friend about DDT. She pointed out how valuable DDT was in the fight against malaria and asked me how I can value a few birds over humans. I said, it's not just birds, it's entire species. And that's kind of where the conversation died. We didn't know how to go any further. We never got around to what we value and why. Second, We need to look at our ethical assumptions. This is another difficult task. I have found that once I make an assumption, it tends to become a, quote, truth that I take for granted, and I don't think about it again. If an entire society made an assumption years ago, very few people will notice it and ask questions such as, is this assumption working for us? Why did we make this assumption? What was our reasoning? With the new knowledge we have now, would we make that assumption again? Changing our assumptions shakes everything up, which is emotionally uncomfortable. But our current assumptions are not creating a sustainable lifestyle, and that is getting uncomfortable too. In his book, The Ecology of Eden, Evan Eisenberg explores the attitudes expressed toward nature in Western culture, going all the way back to the Sumerians, which is like 5000 BC. He points out that Western cultures view Earth as man's dominion. He ends his book with, and this is referencing us building a space station. We who have been tossed into the heavens, not just in dreams, but in real life, have been moved in unexpected ways. We feel a rush of love for the Earth's smallness and fragility. If it is plain that the Earth is not all in all, it is even plainer that it is all in all for us, our brave house on the whooshing prairie of space, and not just our house, but our body, a truth we had to leave our body to see. Mr. Eisenberg and I are not the only people thinking that our Western worldview has led us astray. Aldo Leopold said, conservation is getting nowhere because it is incompatible with our Abrahamic concept of land. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. For an indigenous perspective on Western culture, we can turn to Robin Wall Kimmerer, who tells us, quote, after all these generations since Columbus, some of the wisest of native elders still puzzle over the people who came to our shores. They look at the toll on the land and say, the problem with these new people is that they don't have both feet on the shore. One is still on the boat. They don't seem to know whether they're staying or not. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes, scarcely 30 years ago, covering up your mess passed for responsibility, a kind of land as litter box approach. Policy dictated only that land ruined by mining or industry had to be covered by vegetation. With this astroturf strategy, a mining company that destroyed a forest of 200 species could satisfy its legal responsibilities by planting the tailings to alfalfa under a mist of irrigation and fertilizer. We can learn a different way of thinking about our relationship to the land and to the other beings that we share this world with. For help, I suggest we look at the cultures of people who live sustainably, or were able to do it before we came along. You can get a good start on changing your worldview by reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Miss Kimmerer. Here is another quote from this book. In the Western tradition, there is a recognized hierarchy of beings with, of course, the human being on top, the pinnacle of evolution, the darling of creation, and the plants at the bottom. She's a botanist. But in native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way that they live. They teach us by example. End quote. My favorite of her examples is plants know how to make food and medicine from air and water, and then they give it away. For at least 5,000 years, Western cultures have lived with the assumption that humans are smart enough to be in charge of the world. And for a long time, it looked like that was a good assumption. We used our gift of a particular type of intelligence to develop the scientific method, which enabled us to create the modern world with all its comforts and technological marvels, and the ability to render our planet uninhabitable for many species, including our own. The scientific method is only one way of knowing the world. It is very powerful, but it has limitations. For example, it is much better at dissecting a process than understanding a whole system. An important example of this limitation is our inability to create an ecosystem. Let me say that again. We don't know how to create an ecosystem. I mean, we can do little tiny ones in aquariums, but we're not living there. And we are not very good at restoring ecosystems. So we better preserve the ones we were gifted with. To do that, we need to live sustainably. We know that, but it is intellectual knowledge, which is not enough. It doesn't make us change. We need to know this in our hearts, in our very bones. It needs to be emotional knowledge. I am suggesting that the human ability that will help us achieve that emotional knowledge is our ability to worship. We need to develop a new vision of our place in the web of life, a new spirituality that will lead to a new culture of humility and gratitude and joy and love. UUs are already going in that direction. Let us go further and let us bring the world with us. Let us choose to treasure, to truly worship the creation that cradles us. Oh, wait, I think I do closing words, right? Okay. Well, maybe we have the order wrong. Our closing words come to us from Miss Kimmerer. Do eat food that is honorably harvested and celebrate every mouthful. Do use technologies that minimize harm. Do take what is given. This philosophy guides not only our taking of food, but also any taking of the gifts of Mother Earth, air, water, and the literal body of the earth, the rocks and soils and fossil fuels. Ask of any harvest, including energy, that our purpose be worthy of the harvest. Now please rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn number 20.